So I'm just going to get right to the point, even though I've brought this up in several of my videos in the last few months, or I guess you could say the last year for that matter, but Standard has, well, let's just face it, been really terrible as of late, and it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of a lot of different people in this community. The most common complaints I've heard in the last year is there's too many banned cards. It's likely probably at the highest we've ever had, ever, or at least in quite some time. The lack of reprints that are in the overall sets that are in Standard, or I guess you could say the lack of a core set, which Wizards is hopefully going to fix next year, and also the lack of, I guess you could say, powerful cards, or I guess you could say overall synergies of the cards that are in the set. Don't get me wrong, there are quite a few, but compared to Standards prior, they really have kind of just, well, how do I say it, really, not really done a very good job of fitting the puzzle pieces together to really balance out the Standard meta. I guess what I mean to say by this is that some cards just don't really cover all the ground that, I guess you could say, that Wizards has really thought of, which is why they've had to ban so many cards. Now, while I as a player haven't really been following Standard too much lately, mainly just because of a lot of these reasons, I just want to state that I actually love Standard. It might sound weird from someone who doesn't play it anymore, but I used to really, really love Standard. I played Standard for a very big part of my Magic the Gathering career, and honestly, it's a really fun format. Not only is Standard a good constructed format for new players to jump in on, but it's also a very challenging format in the fact that you have to use cards that are in a very small selected pool of cards to build a very powerful deck, and getting there can be a really fun and, well, I guess you could say rewarding challenge when you get that right mixture of balance and power. And if anything, I feel like that's what Standard should be all about, balance and power. But as we can tell from the previous bannings and, well, I guess you could say lack of powerful yet balanced cards, this Standard really hasn't been doing that. Today I want to talk about the best Standard format that I have ever played. Not just because it reminds me of the good times I had playing Standard, but because Wizards just didn't seem to really pick up the fact that this Standard really, really kicked ass. And let's just face it, after that it didn't really kick ass quite as much. Now, because making an overlay of this will likely take me a few hours, if not maybe half of a day, I'm just going to state that the best Standard format that I have ever played was the one that featured Innistrad block, Core Set 2013, Return to Ravnica block, and Core Set 2014. This format lasted from the fall of 2012 to the fall of 2013, and honestly, this was a time where Standard was just awesome. There was literally so many cool creative decks that you could play, and so many awesome synergies and mechanics that basically just almost any card was playable. It was just insane. It was like the whole format had opened up. But to really express myself and how awesome this format was, I'm going to need to talk to you about what happened before this in Standard. More specifically, I want to go back 2 years before this Standard actually happened, where we had arguably one of the biggest crises in Standard in the last 10 years of the format. This is when this guy was in the format, and as you can probably imagine or remember, he caused a lot of trouble. All the decks that played blue used him, and frankly, let's just face it, a brainstorm every turn turned out to be really flippin' good for that format. For whatever the reason, they had to ban Jace the Mind Sculptor, which I guess kind of made sense because he was in every deck in the format, but they also had to ban Stoneforge Mystic, and that was kind of a big deal because it had been a really long time since we had 2 cards banned in Standard. Because of this, everyone in the community held their breath and was completely shocked, and a lot of people also got salty just because they invested so much money in Jace the Mind Sculptor. And, well, yeah, let's just face it, if you spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars, which at the time, a set of Jace the Mind Sculptor was probably about $800, if not more, yeah, you have every reason to be salty. After these bannings, the format kind of flattened out a little bit more because creatures that didn't have triggered abilities or didn't have haste or ways to come back from the graveyard were a lot more viable, simply because Jace couldn't bounce them anymore. However, after that format, the format shifted and a new set was released to the public. This set is argued by many to be one of the greatest Magic the Gathering sets ever printed, and that set was, well, Innistrad. However, upon its release, I really wasn't too impressed with Innistrad. This was because I felt like a lot of the cards that we had in the previous standard really didn't meet up to the current power level of Innistrad. I felt like the set was overall a little bit weaker than Zendikar was, and all those cards like Jace the Mind Sculptor. However, as I continued to play, I think my love of the cards actually grew, and I began to realize that the cards in Innistrad were just as powerful as those in Zendikar. You had to use them in just different contexts. Another benefit of the set was that as the block continued to roll out when Dark Ascension and Avacyn Restored were released, I feel like a lot of these pieces came to really shape up the block really well, and I felt like a lot of the cards really kind of that were added to this sets or to the sets really rounded out the block as a whole. For example, the card Pillar of Flame, which is a sorcery speed shock that exiles a creature that is put into a graveyard this way with it, was a key piece to a lot of red decks or decks that splashed red in this format. This card I feel was a little bit underrated just because a lot of the creatures before it that were released in the set had lots of ways to come back from the dead and really counted on being exiled to get them off the table completely. In addition, Innistrad block also brought us several other great cards that we use today in both Legacy, Modern, and quite possibly even Vintage. Cards like Liliana of the Veil, Snapcaster Mage, Wild Defiance in Infect decks, Huntmaster of the Fells, which is used in a lot of mid-range decks in Modern, Restoration Angel, which is used in a lot of control and mid-range decks in internal formats. It also combos well with Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker, and several others. While this standard was a lot of fun, it wasn't entirely perfect, mainly due to one, well, I guess you could say, archetype. And that was the Delver deck. Yes, Delver of Secrets was kind of a big deal in this standard format, as these decks just kept popping up all over the format, and a lot of them were really kind of annoying to deal with. Honestly, I kind of feel like even though these decks were very powerful, I don't think they were unstoppable, but I felt like the biggest complaint I heard in that standard season was the amount of Delver decks that were running around the format, and now that no one can stop them. Of course, these complaints kind of got humorous after the while, as a lot of people at my meta, these complaints kind of got humorous after the while. No, come on. These complaints kind of got humorous after a while as people realized, These complaints kind of got humorous after a while because a lot of people in my game stores figured out that if you resolve a Sword of Body and Mind against a Delver deck, it basically tears that deck to pieces really quickly. But honestly, these decks did very, very well. These decks were very popular in high-level tournaments and even the Pro Tour itself. However, Delver decks aside, the format wasn't bad until a set called M13 came out. M13 was kind of a bit of a confusing core set compared to M12. Compared to it, it lacked a lot of the things that M12 featured, and upon its release, I thought it was probably one of the worst core sets ever printed. The main reason for this was just because the set just seemed completely unbalanced. The cards just had such a high mana cost, and a lot of the cards just seemed to just not do enough for the mana you put into them. One card that really stood out to me in terms of power compared to the rest of the cards was Thragtusk. Thragtusk just seemed like a huge powerhouse, and just seemed like it was incredibly playable at the time. It gave you 5 life and a really powerful creature for 5 mana, and it gave you a 3/3 beast when it left the battlefield. Not when it died, when it left the battlefield. This means cards that were highly played, such as Vapor Snag, which were incredibly popular at the time in the format, got a lot weaker. In addition, you could also really synergize Thragtusk to a greatest extent with cards like Restoration Angel or any other similar effect that blinked or exiled the creature and returned it to play or to your hand in some shape or fashion. In short, you could basically just get infinite value out of Thragtusk if you played your cards right. Another thing that really was bothersome about M13 is a lot of cards that were found in the core set M12 and the other core sets prior were completely gone. For example, classic cards like Day of Judgment, the classic 4-mana board wipe that destroyed all creatures, were replaced by Planar Cleansing. At the time, I thought this was very strange, but it wasn't until the next block that all my expectations of M13 kind of made a big 360. Enter the next block, Return to Ravnica. This was one badass set. Well, not just a badass set, I'm glad, but a badass block. I think Wizards just nailed the nail on the head with Return to Ravnica block in general. It not only features some of my favorite cards ever, but arguably some of the most powerful cards ever that are played in Modern today. The most well-known of these cards are the 10 shock lands that are featured throughout the block. It's possible to get a shock land in just about any booster pack in the block. These lands are very, very popular in Modern and are probably some of the most sought-after cards within the block. Standard not only got a big treat by getting these and allowing Standard players to go on and play Modern if they wished, but there were several other fantastic cards that not only saw play in Standard, but even broke into the Legacy format. Return to Ravnica featured a cycle of uncounterable spells, which were the colors at the time of the 5 shock lands that were introduced to the set. Blue and white, the Azorius Guild had Supreme Verdict, which was a fantastic counterspell which worked really well against blue decks that relied on creatures. Abrupt Decay, which is featured in several decks throughout constructed for Magic to this day, allows you to tear through and destroy just about any permanent that has converted mana cost 3 or less without the fear of having it being countered. This was huge just because decks like Counterbalance and decks that used Chalice of the Void had a really hard time against this card. Slaughter of Games was basically a uncounterable version of Memoricide, and it just was a fantastic card to take out those nasty decks that relied on one nasty win condition and a bunch of counterspells to protect it. Luxodon Smiter, although didn't see too much Legacy play, was still played in the format somewhat and is arguably a very powerful creature by today's standards. A 4/4/3 really goes a long way. In addition, it also had another benefit in which if your opponent decided to Thoughtseize you and all you had was Luxodon Smiters, you'd get a free Luxodon Smiter, which was actually a nice benefit at times. Finally, probably the least played of these was Counterflux, which is a uncounterable counterspell. We had seen uncounterable counterspells before, but Counterflux offered the added benefit of the Izzet's new mechanic, Overload, which would allow you to combat annoying combos like Storm Combo. All these spells did see some play in Standard and many other formats afterwards. In addition to these powerhouse cards, Return to Ravnica also introduced us to... In addition to these powerhouse cards, the Return to Ravnica block also featured Jace the Architect of Thought, which was nowhere near as powerful against Jace the Mind Sculptor, but does still see some play in Modern today against decks that rely on lots of tokens. Detention Sphere, an enchantment that kind of combines Oblivion Ring with Maelstrom Pulse. Domrirad, a highly underrated planeswalker, which still serves a purpose in some aggro and mid-range decks today in Modern. Although it is very few and far in between, it does provide enormous card advantage in creature-based synergies. Lotleth Troll. In Modern, this thing can occasionally pop up in Dredge decks, as it's a great enabler to start out your Dredge streak. Blood Baron of Vizkopa, probably one of the most underrated 5-drops ever printed. In Modern, this thing is kind of tricky to kill, as most removal is black or white, and it gives you a lot of life in the process. Voice of Resurgence, probably the best 2-drop in the block. Still used today in Modern in several Collected Company decks, and decks that rely on sacrificing creatures to get more value. Although it does see play in Modern occasionally, Dreadbore at the time was kind of a revolutionary spell, just because it was the only spell at the time that actually destroyed creatures and/or planeswalkers. Although we got several other spells like it in the future, this was kind of a big deal, and it was nice to have, considering planeswalkers were kind of a big stink in Standard. There are also several other cards that were introduced that are played to this day in Modern, but probably the biggest complaint I did hear about this format was due to Sphinx's Revelation. This card was really powerful, but a lot of fun to play if you could get a large enough one. Drawing X cards and gaining X life at instant speed was very powerful, but the good news is that there were several ways that you could counter it quite effectively. Here's a handful of them right now. It is true that Sphinx's Revelation was a really powerful card, but it didn't have to be banned. In fact, nothing had to be banned. Everything had enough counters to really put the format in really a state where everything was viable. And plus, there were several other great ways to win games. Players would be winning games with cards like Door to Nothingness, Nephalia Drownyard, and even humongous green spells like Primal Surge and Craterhoof Behemoth. And the crazy thing about this is these decks actually worked. And not only that, they were fun and enjoyable to play. It felt like almost every card in this format was viable. Although the format was phenomenal at this time, there were a couple things that Magic players were a little bit, I guess you could say, missing at the moment. But all that changed when M14 came into play. M14 really filled up the holes in the standard and put a lot of cards in the format that a lot of players really wanted. For example, a lot of players in my game stores requested that they really could use a Doomblade in some of their decks. And guess what was printed in M14? Yep, you guessed it, Doomblade. A lot of other players requested that they needed to be a bit more hate creatures to really prevent a lot of the strategies that were running around in the meta. These players' cries were not unanswered as Wizards released a cycle of 5 hate creatures that focused on 2 enemy colors of the card that the creature was featured in. These cards saw lots of play in Standard, and do occasionally see some play in Modern. The set also had a lot of cards that really got players excited, such as the introduction of Scavenging Ooze into a core set, which allowed it to be Modern playable. It is often played in Modern to this day, although lately it's been kind of in moderation. And Mutavault, a classic mana land that thrived in tribal decks. These cards were very well accepted, and for the rest of the format, it made a lot of big impact. Now, while all these cards were really phenomenal, and a lot of decks in the format were really fun to play, like all standards, it had to come to an end. In the fall of that year, Wizards released the Theros block, which kicked out the Innistrad and core set M13, and the format, well, kind of changed. Although the great cards that were from the Return to Ravnica block were still in the format, the format, I feel, was ruined by one particular card. I'm sure all of you know this story if you played Standard during this time period, but as we all know, Grey Merchant of Asphodel ruined that format. And yes, although Thoughtseize was a very powerful card, every black deck ran Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Some decks didn't need a whole playset of Thoughtseize, although it was pretty common. Grey Merchant of Asphodel was a 4-of in all of these decks, and made a lot of aggro decks really pissed off. From there, I kind of felt like Wizards just kind of seemed to lose it as years went by. Core set M15 was okay, but it seemed to be more about powerhouse cards and experimentation than actual, well, I guess you could say being a fair format. I feel like Wizards tried to reboot this magic that this old Standard format had when they released Khans of Tarkir with cards like the old Fetch lands. There were also several other fantastic cards in the set, but I feel like Wizards could never really get the hold of the magic that format that featured Innistrad, M13, Return to Ravnica block, and M14 had all those years ago. After this, the set format changed similar to the way we have now. Starting with the Battle for Zendikar block, we got rid of all the core sets and just have 2 sets per block, with a total of 4 sets per year. Hopefully this will change when we have a new core set, but I really feel like Standard has really just gone downhill. Now you might be wondering, why on earth has Wizards decided to do this and not try to do something else or make a format that was similar to this format that featured these sets with all these wonderful cards that are played in Constructed Magic to this day? Well, none of these cards that you see here are in Standard at the moment, and honestly, it's kind of a shock that none of them have returned because of their iconic state that they had to the game. It is true that Standard does have to change every year, but it just doesn't make any sense on how we came from having this wonderful format that was so well balanced, had all these wonderful cards, and so many fantastic synergies and fantastic decks, to a format where decks are usually kind of just one-dimensional, and everything is banned and unbalanced just because Wizards is afraid to make powerful cards like these. So, I guess in simple terms, the reason that this format was the best Standard format I ever played was just because cards were powerful, but they were fair. Decks were unique and experimental, but worked. Games were long and interactive and a lot of fun, and you could talk about how you had such great excitement for hours on end. There really weren't that many ridiculous combos in the format, most of which involved cards like Boros Reckoner and something else to give it lifelink and indestructible so it could keep damaging itself. That took at least 5 or 6 turns to get active. Standard made the recent mistake of making Feldar Guardian a combo with Saheeli Rai, and that got banned pretty quickly. But aside from that, the format was really, really fair, and let's just face it, no one really complained too much, except for maybe Sphinx's Revelation, but I think the only reason that got so much hate was just because it gave people so many cards. There were honestly several ways to defeat Sphinx's Revelation, as I mentioned earlier, and that wasn't even all of them that I showed you. But the reason I'm just baffled here these days is why can't Standard be more like this? It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It just has to be fun, it has to be fair, it has to have cards that we want and that we will play for years on end. Most of the cards that I showed you here today are still played in Modern and Legacy to some degree, and even though some of them aren't, I wouldn't count those entirely out. These are some very powerful cards that I was not only excited to play for Standard, but for years after. Cards these days, although there are some that are very playable in formats like Modern and Legacy, just don't really have that same vibe, that same sense of power and authority that these cards do. If anything, I wish Wizards could make a format, or standard format, that is more like this, and that we don't have to ban everything, or we don't have to ban things that are way too powerful just because we didn't really cover their ground or cover their guard. Like, we didn't have to ban Sphinx's Revelation because we had so much hand disruption and combo hate or card hate that was just in this format at the time. Standard now doesn't really seem to be like this just because we have to ban everything. And this is why this is the best Standard format that I have ever played. Hands down. And that's why I think this is the best Standard format I've ever played. If you agree with me, or if you think there is another Standard format that you thought was the best Standard format of all time, feel free to let me know about it in the comment section below. If this is your first time ever checking out my channel, please like and subscribe, as it does help get this and other of my videos about Magic the Gathering out there. Thank you again for watching. My name is Ryu Spectre, and I will see you all next time.